Welcome to the Memorial Day episode of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Memorial Day Monday with me here in New York. I apologize again, my voice still hasn't come back entirely. I still don't feel 100%. It's good that I don't have to be around a lot of people. But if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, enjoy it, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. So I personally did not serve in the military. I was born after there was such things as peacetime draft, and there weren't any world wars or potential world wars where there would ever be a groundswell to reinstitute the draft. But honestly, after Vietnam, I just don't see a draft ever being put back into the hopper, as they say. I just don't see it. And certainly, people have debated the concept of conscription and what amounts to indentured servitude in service in support of your country. Is it okay? Is it not okay? It's not really the focus here today. 3 people on my father's side of the family, including him, served in the military. And on my mother's side, her father, Grandpa Barron, served. And he wasn't actually overseas during World War II. He was stateside. My mother grew up near a military base in Macon, Georgia. Grandpa, by that time, her father, that is, was not an active participant in the war at that time. He did not get wounded. He did not take any heavy fire, any injuries at that point in time. My dad's 2 uncles, my uncles as well, Sidney and Albert, both enlisted after Pearl Harbor. Now that's a cliche, but only because it was true for so many young men in this country when World War II, I don't want to say started, but when it was about to start, before it reached what was considered World War II. After Pearl Harbor, my grandmother, my dad's mom, her brothers, Albert and Sidney, they enlisted. And Sidney was a bachelor. Albert was married, but he did not have children yet. But they both enlisted. And both of them were wounded in combat just after D-Day. I want to say D-Day +2, not 100% on that, but they were both wounded about a mile or so inland, not long after the actual June 6, 1945, D-Day. Now I remember as a little boy, I was a smart kid. I asked a lot of questions, but just asking questions and getting answers, it doesn't mean that things are necessarily going to make an impression on you or that you're going to carry information you receive forward for the rest of your life. I never got to ask Uncle Sidney the questions that I got to ask Uncle Albert. Uncle Albert was somebody who I believe always looked older than he actually was. He was the youngest in the family. He probably would have been around 60 when I was a little kid. But to me, he just always looked older. The world had hardened him. And he was a jovial kind of a guy. Albert, from this perspective, is somebody that I always aspired to be like. He was exceedingly non-judgmental. He tried to build bridges. He tried to get along with everybody. He wasn't necessarily the most scholarly guy, but he wasn't stupid. People have different areas in the academic or intellectual arena in which they excel and other areas that they don't. Albert liked telling stories. He liked hearing stories. And he just always seemed to be in a good mood. Loved eating bread and cake. He put ketchup in soup, put ketchup on everything. I mean, everything. Used to drive my grandmother crazy. And her going crazy when I was a little boy, she presumably had gone crazy for the last 4 decades, 5 decades already. Albert, you can't put ketchup in matzo ball soup. Yeah, he can. When I was a little boy, though, and I didn't know anything about war. Yeah, I'd heard of World War II. Pearl Harbor, I'm sure, had come up at some point. But just cursory glance in a book or something briefly on television or the phrase D-Day doesn't really mean anything. On a random day in Little Neck, which is where Albert and Faye, my aunt and uncle, lived. I grew up in Massapequa. Not a terrible ride over there, 35 minutes without traffic, maybe a little less. But I saw that Albert had something. He was wearing a kind of shirt, and I saw something I hadn't really seen up close before. It was like a little button, a little nodule. It looked like skin on his back, like over there. I asked him what it was. And he said, that was where I got shot. That's where the bullet came through. Got shot. When did you get shot, Uncle Albert? Got shot. When I was a little kid, I was probably tearing up already. I didn't have any conception that he was going to say something about getting shot. So in very broad terms, he told me that he had fought in the war and that he was shot, what they called a through and through, where he took a bullet. I don't know if it entered in the back and went through the front. I don't remember that. I feel like it went through this way, straight through. They patched him up on the field, and I hate to call it $1 million wound. You know, Forrest Gump kind of repopularized that phrase. They call that $1 million wound, but I don't know about that. I didn't see a cent of that money. They patched him up on the field and sent him home. When I asked Albert, my uncle, a few more questions, in the nicest possible way that he could, because I was a small boy, I was showing normal curiosity. I wasn't being annoying. I wasn't being a troll at age 6 or however old I was. I was genuinely curious, and I'm sure my eyes were very, very big because I hadn't imagined I was going to be having a conversation like this. Thought we were going to talk about the Yankees. But he didn't want to talk about his experience in the war. And it's something I understand now, and something that I came to understand as I got older, meeting with other people, talking with other people, especially when I got to college. And a couple of years after that, seeing Saving Private Ryan, and with the advent of the internet and the proliferation of so much information available at our fingertips, I began to understand the greatest generation. They saw shit that none of us should ever have to see, that they shouldn't have had to see. And maybe they just don't want to talk about it. Can't ever forget it. Albert didn't want to talk about anything other than he got hit, didn't hurt very much. They patched him up on the field. His life was not in danger, fortunately, because of where the bullet went through. I remember him telling me that the medic asked him, "Where do you think you got shot? I can't find a bullet." He said, "I don't know. I got hit here, but I don't know where the bullet is." And then they realized the bullet had gone through. So Uncle Albert was patched up, and he went home. And whatever service medals he accrued, he would say he didn't really do anything other than get shot. But he is one of millions of Americans who spilled blood in enemy soil. Or in this case, not enemy soil. They were in France, but overseas. Young men. Albert was maybe 22, 23. Maybe he was slightly older. He was no older than 25, though. He was somewhere in the early to mid-20s. I don't remember exactly what year. I think he was born in 1919, but I'm not 100% on that. He came home and he lived a normal life. Maybe he didn't ever get full range of motion on that side ever again. He never complained. He never said anything. And it's not something that he liked talking about. He didn't want to talk about it at all. And I guess I should consider myself fortunate that my inquisitive nature did not meet with a harsher response, which would have been completely understandable, 100% understandable, if he had not been as gentle and patient and polite with me. It's a totally different kind of story then, because then I would have been sore and I wouldn't have understood. I didn't think I had. It's okay, Jer. A lot of people just don't want to talk about it. But Albert lived a normal life, a good life, raised 2 daughters, still with us, and got along so well with everybody. Never nasty, never angry, always ready with a smile and a story. And if you had a story, he would listen. His brother, my grandma's other brother, Sidney, he was wounded much more seriously. By the time I was of age, let's say 5, where I could understand things such as this guy walks with a pronounced limp, this individual has difficulty speaking clearly. Well, I asked questions. Why does Uncle Sidney have to use a cane? He really wasn't that old. Everybody looks ancient to you when you're a kid. But Uncle Sidney was probably in his mid-60s when I was, let's say, kindergarten age. Maybe he was slightly older than that, maybe. But he looked at least 15 years older than his actual age. He could barely walk by the time it got to the late 1970s. And I didn't ask him. I never asked him. I asked my dad. I don't even think I asked Grandpa Nat. Well, it was Grandma Irene's brother. But I think I asked my dad. I said, what happened to Uncle Sidney? Why does he walk like that? Why does he speak like that? Dad said, well, you know how your Uncle Albert was wounded. Sidney got shot in the spine. He had a brain injury. Bullet lodged at the base. I think the bullet may have lodged at the base of his spine. It took away a certain percentage of his capacity, motor coordination, for the rest of his life. Now, I didn't spend an inordinate amount of time pondering this. I was just a kid. But I looked at him differently after that. And I did start looking at older people, especially if they were wearing a hat which indicated what regiment they served with. Even as a little kid, I started to understand. It isn't something that you normally think about. Well, I would say most people don't, and I wouldn't have if I didn't have family. It probably wouldn't have come up. Not that I would have been dismissive, but it's different when it's somebody you know, who you love, who has been there for you as much as they can. Sidney wasn't very old when he passed. He was probably like 73 or 4. But the last 5 decades of his life were very difficult because he had difficulty getting around. And even though the U.S. government, they were very generous, he got a lot of money for the wound, for having been wounded as he had, and service medals, and I don't know, Purple Heart, Silver Star, Combat Cross, I don't know exactly what, but Sidney was an incredibly generous person. And so I began to form a picture of a generation. And when we say Memorial Day, and the general idea, because there's a ton of information, but what's the difference between Memorial Day and Veterans Day? My interpretation is that it doesn't just mean that somebody died in battle, but that somebody's life, not that was defined by being wounded, but somebody's life was shortened, directly impacted by injuries they sustained. In Albert's case, he 98% lived a normal life after the horrors of World War II. Sidney, no. Ultimately, his injuries shortened his lifespan and made his life way more difficult than it otherwise would have been. And walking with a limp. My dad said his earliest memories of Uncle Sidney, he was limping. The guy was like 32, maybe 33 at the time of the story my dad is telling me. He said, yeah, your uncle always walked with a limp. And that got progressively worse and worse over time. When I was 6, I remember getting a birthday gift from Uncle Sidney. Apparently, it was a birthday gift that I got every year from him until I was 12. But when I was 6, it was the first year that my parents felt that I was old enough to be told exactly what it was and why and how. So I opened a piece of mail from Sidney Weinstein, who lived in Miami Beach at the time. And it was this thing, it looked like a check, but it wasn't a check. It was a treasury bill, paid to the order of Jeremy Scott Cohen in the amount of $1,000. My Uncle Sidney, every year, from I think age either 1 or 2 through age 12, Uncle Sidney sent me a $1,000 U.S. savings bond. Now, the way it worked at the time, I don't know if it's the same now, and I'm not exactly sure whether this was officially a T-bill. I don't know the mechanics of it. But what I know is, for every 1,000, he would have had to put up 500. That's how it was done back in the day. And depending on interest rates that were locked in, they could tell you, literally, this will come due in 6 years. This will come due in 7 years and 3 months, whatever. Well, I just thought it was really cool that my uncle was doing that. But he was able to do it because of the military pension that the government had given him that he was living on. And he was somebody who, at a very young age, probably because of his injuries, he stopped entirely living for himself. Or I should say, he stopped living for himself entirely and began seeing what good he could do for others. Another thing, as a little kid, it's not that you don't put it through the mental meat grinder. That's at like level 6. And even for a smart, precocious kid, as I allegedly was, that concept is beyond. That is not something that you can even fathom. My Uncle Sidney didn't have that much in the way of family. And he saw his nephew, me, a little bit of a miracle nephew. He knew my dad really well. My dad was super awkward, way more awkward than me. And much like Grandpa Nat and Grandma Irene, they never would have verbalized this to me. Guaranteed, they never would have said this. But I don't know if they thought my dad was ever going to have a family. They maybe thought he was too awkward to do that. The fact that he got with somebody like my mom was pretty amazing, given what I could surmise about his younger life and how he had difficulty interacting with others. Classic, brilliant, neurodivergent kid who has trouble relating to other people, so focused on his own stuff. But Sidney saw me as I wasn't expecting to get a nephew. I got to try to take care of this kid if I can. And that's what he did. Now, I appreciated it. Wow, that's so cool. But more from that perspective. That's so generous. Looking back on it now, I understand. War had made him less than what he otherwise would have been. Let some other people I love, family, benefit from what I went through. I don't believe that Sidney ever went into detail about the horrors of war from his perspective, but he didn't need to. Just knowing where he got shot and laying out there on the field. Albert got seen pretty quick. I think that Sidney was laying there for quite some time. It's inconceivable. And as much as I know Hollywood it's Hollywood. Even a movie such as Saving Private Ryan in some quarters could be seen as not so much taking advantage of history, but that the brutality of the D-Day sequence is so horrible and so intense. But at the end of the film, when the character who is supposed to be Ryan, Matt Damon's character, the age makeup or however they did that, or they got an older guy who vaguely resembled Matt Damon, when he says words to the effect of, did we earn this? Did I earn this? That's not really a question that can be answered. My perception is the best we can do is honor them by honoring their memories and understanding people like my uncles, and there are so many, and many of you have family members, grandparents, or if you're a lot younger than me, great grandparents, great uncles, who made the ultimate sacrifice on the field. They didn't even make it home, even in Vietnam. Or if you want to go back more generations, World War I. But we honor them and we understand they showed not just courage, but a love of country and a certain spirit that we got attacked. Doesn't matter if there's any draft. We're going. Fuck that. This is not going to stand. We're going to take the fight to them. And it is a very particular generation that is called the greatest generation. The young men that went to war, so many who didn't return, storming the beach, which amounted to a suicide mission. Maybe they knew, maybe they didn't. And I remember seeing the movie Gallipoli about Australia's involvement in World War I. Peter Weir, great movie, right? Young Mel Gibson, incredible film. In that movie, that was even more of a suicide mission. You're scratching your head and you're saying, why did they even do this? Why do something that has no chance for success? It is such a horrifying thing to ponder from up here, saying to yourself, what's the acceptable number of dead Americans? We're going to run thousands of them through a meat grinder, and an overwhelming high percentage of the first ones out of the boats are going to die. What do we tell the families? We better win this fucking war. And that's a thing that, as a kid, I don't know that I would have understood. Because one thing that Saving Private Ryan, I think, gets exactly right, other than the realities of the battle, which we know Spielberg does not screw around, and the way that he made that film, the brutality, I know that he was trying to show this was not a random war. This was the war. We had to do it. And look at the sacrifices that these people made. But when you think of so many young men paying the ultimate price, and we say to ourselves, because as I saw Saving Private Ryan, I was old enough, I was 23, 24. I understood the character that's supposed to be General Marshall. I think Marshall was a 5-star general. When the implication is, because all of Ryan's brothers have died, we have to find him. Yeah, he might be dead too. The paratroopers, that was a famous thing. They did that in the movie The Longest Day 35 years earlier. They missed their drop point. It was a complete clusterfuck. So Matt Damon's, I think it was James Ryan, he's probably dead. We have to try to find him. As terrible as it is, sometimes public relations victories is all you have. It's all you can have. And as a kid, I would not have understood any of that. But as an adult, a young adult, I understood. We're in serious shit here. Times a million. We're in big trouble. People are looking for something to latch on to, some bit of good news amidst all this horror. They found him. Even with all the infighting among the guys, the Edward Burns character, Vin Diesel, and Tom Hanks as Miller, we got to follow orders, guys. What you and I think about the idea, the concept of this mission, we could sit, the math doesn't make sense. We're probably all going to get killed and not even find this guy. We got to follow orders. We got to do it. And the fact that they do it, sorry, spoiler alert, and he's still alive, we're led to believe the character of Ryan, into his 70s, did I earn this? I think of things such as, not me personally, but are we living up to the ideals of that generation? I don't know. It's a different world. I'm not one to automatically dismiss that every young person is a piece of crap or, whatever. Because when I was a kid, they said the same about Generation X, what became Generation X. No one wants to work. You all want everything done for you. We're doomed because you guys are a bunch of slackers and fucking idiots. So 35 years ago, that's what I heard about Gen X. So I don't immediately agree when people say, you're a bunch of clowns. Everyone's too sensitive. Nobody wants to get a job. Go in one ear and out the other. I like to try to give people a benefit of the doubt. I'm not into making blanket statements. Oh, we haven't earned it. And it's up for debate. It still had to be done. But whenever I see an older individual wearing a hat that indicates service, I pause. And I haven't had a moment, it's never come up, where I saw a service member in uniform or a retired service member wearing a hat where I had an opportunity to introduce myself and ask him, can I buy you a drink or can I buy you dinner? It hasn't come up. But that is something that I know to do if the opportunity presents itself. And it just happened. There was one time at Outback many years ago where I thought it was going to happen. Somebody beat me to the punch and the guy had already ordered a drink. That is, to me, the smallest bit of courtesy and appreciation you can give to somebody who is in the service. Now, I want to close on my father's story, which is that he was drafted in the Vietnam era, but Vietnam had not escalated yet. And so my father, who was already an accountant and a pretty damn good accountant at that, even at such a young age, he was 22, 23. In fact, I think he was 21 when he was drafted. He was already working in the city. He went through basic training, and because the escalation had not happened, it was very unlikely that any of the young accountants that went through basic, there are more of them than you would think, were going to end up with a rifle in their hands. Somebody's got to balance the books, even in the Army. My dad was an Army accountant. It's exactly what he did. So after basic, he stayed at Fort Jackson for the entirety of his 2 years in the military. And he always, until his last days, considered himself incredibly fortunate that he was not sent into the middle of it. I still have his uniform in the closet. It's something I will always hold on to. Every now and then you look at it, the name Cohen, and the stripes that he got. Yeah, for a bookworm, he ended up being a pretty good soldier from what I can gather. But, and I'm sorry I don't remember the gentleman's name, but one of the young soldiers is about my father's age. I think this guy was maybe 1 year older. So you're talking about 22, 23 years old tops, my dad being 21 and 22, give or take. One guy who went through basic with my father was sent to Vietnam, not with the rifle that he had been trained to use and the grenades that he had been trained to launch. And, you know, they all went through the same exercises, whether they eventually were going to be in combat or not. This guy went over there to work in the finance office near our embassy. He died with a pencil in his hand. The enemy blew up the outpost where he was working. He was doing accounting work when he died. He died in action, just not in the conventional way. That could have been my dad. And Alan Philip Cohen would have been mourned in a different way. He would have been so young. That was just bad luck, random, horrendous luck of the draw. The one guy they chose to go overseas and work over there doing the same thing that they were doing at Fort Jackson. He dies without a rifle in his hands, without even a chance. Dies while working in the finance office. These are things that I ponder, more so as I get older, understanding how good I've had it, how lucky I've been. And so many of us, because we never even had to consider taking enemy fire, storming a beach where it's about 90% that we're going to get chopped up and killed right then and there. I will always be grateful, and it's not a controversial position. I will always be grateful for the service of all of those brave Americans who went into hostile territories, maybe not even believing in what we were doing. They did it anyway. And many were critically wounded. Some passed on the field of battle. These are things I think of every Memorial Day. And now that I'm 50, especially this Memorial Day, 2024. Thank you for joining me for episode 197 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all thanks for tuning in.